Hey everybody, let's talk about games. The thing about media is it's iterative. It's a process and games are no different. They build off the work that came before them and influence the works that follow. Contemporaries can challenge each other and inspiration can be drawn from a diverse range of sources. I'm going to explore the history of the RPG genre, important works and their evolution from humble beginnings to the art form we recognize today. So, let's start at the beginning. When you're talking about RPGs, the starting point is pretty obvious. It's a game you may have heard of. In the early 1970s, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson collaborated to produce the first edition of the Dungeons & Dragons gaming system. In D&D, essentially one player takes on the role of DM or Dungeon Master. This player controls the world the game takes place in, while all other players control a single character. The DM tells a story in which the players can choose which action their characters take, and the success or failure of these actions is determined using dice rolls. D&D is widely recognized as the granddaddy of all RPGs, but Dungeons & Dragons wasn't developed in a vacuum. It had its own diverse catalog of media that it tapped for inspiration. Thematically, the game was influenced by mythology, religion, literature, and mysticism from all around the world. The biggest influence on the game setting was the contemporary fantasy genre, established by J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series, but influences in the setting were as broad as Lewis Carroll's poem Jabberwocky, Robert E. Howard's Conan series, ancient Norse, Greek, Celtic, and Arabic mythology, and the Bible. In terms of game structure, D&D has two major lines of influence. First of all, there's the role-playing aspect of the game that the players engage in. It has its roots in both improv theater and the oral tradition. Conflict resolution using dice was based on miniature war games, particularly Gygax's previous project, Chainmail. Honestly, I could trace the gameplay back to oral epics like the Odyssey and 5,000-year-old Turkish dice, but I'll leave it at that because 1974 is a much tidier date to start from than 3000 BCE. In 1974, a hand-assembled run of 1,000 copies was released. In the second year, they sold 3,000, and the game began to develop a larger following. Since then, D&D has seen 5 editions over 40 years, 20 million players over its lifetime, and has sold over $1 billion worth of merchandise. A group of programmers working at the University of Illinois' PLATO computer mainframe got their hands on one of the first printings of Dungeons & Dragons. Before D&D had been out a year, the RPG moved beyond the tabletop and into the digital. Legend has it the first RPG program was called M119H and was created in 1974, but this game has been lost forever, assumed to be deleted by the university administration shortly after its creation. The mainframe it was created on was meant only for academic use. The first RPG that still exists was designated Petit 5, named after the block of memory it was created in, and it was nicknamed Dungeon. RPGs in this style popped up all over university campuses in the mid to late 70s, but Dungeon is our earliest example. The creator, Rusty Rutherford, cites Dungeons & Dragons as the primary inspiration for this game. Quote, "I used the basic features of D&D as much as possible. Hit points, monster levels, experience, and treasure rewards, and so on. The character was a combined fighter/magic user/cleric. In a monster encounter, the character had a choice to fight, cast a spell, or run. After that, if the monster was not defeated or avoided, it was a fight to the finish run entirely by the computer. Any user on the university network could access this game, and their scores were recorded in a database that all players could view." Despite this fact, Space Invaders, released 3 years later, is often cited as inventing the high score table. In 1976, there was D&D, also on the PLATO system. It played much like Dungeon, but it was the first RPG to incorporate a story for the player. In D&D, you had to get the orb out of the dungeon. That was it. It wasn't much, but it was the start. 1977 brought Colossal Cave Adventure, or simply Adventure, which is credited as being the first game of progression. It shifted the focus to more structured, slower, objective-based gameplay, rather than an emphasis on scores alone. Adventure was the forerunner for the adventure game genre, and the game's design philosophy was a paradigm shift in RPGs and gaming as a whole. During this time, development of RPGs on the PLATO system was still very much active, with 1977 marking the release of Oubliette, a much more sophisticated game than earlier PLATO RPGs. Oubliette included races and classes for the player to choose, as well as a first-person dungeon view and real-time, networked multiplayer. This game was so difficult, in fact, that it required teamwork to do nearly anything. 1978's Mud 1 was another early game with simultaneous multiplayer, written by students at Essex University. Although it was closer to a text adventure than a traditional RPG, lacking character stats, levels, and combat, it spawned the MUD subgenre of text-based online games which adopted RPG conventions into gameplay. Connected to ARPANET and containing a persistent world, MUD 1 is recognized as the first MMO in gaming history. 1979 saw the release of Atari's Adventure for the Atari 2600. Unlike other computers at the time, the Atari was a gaming console built with colorful graphics in mind. Although it lacked most of the RPG genre's conventions, Adventure was the first attempt to take the RPG-style gameplay to the setting of home consoles. Adventure was lauded for shattering gameplay conventions, one of the first mainstream titles to remove staples such as time limits and scores. 1979 also marked the release of The Temple of Apshai. It may not be the first commercial release, but Temple of Apshai was undoubtedly the first commercial hit in the genre. It sold 30,000 copies in 3 years. In 1982, it was tied for the position of the third best-selling PC game of all time. The technology still didn't exist to render detailed visuals, but Apshai was notable in being the first dungeon to include detailed room descriptions, albeit included in the menu. It was also one of the first games to implement on-disk saving, although this feature was added sometime after its initial release. Rogue was released in 1980 by 2 students at Berkeley University. Although the graphics are ASCII only, the gameplay arguably stands the test of time better than any game to come before it. Rogue has procedurally generated levels, which means the computer would use an algorithm to build a new, random dungeon every time you played, and this is the first RPG to implement a hunger and character starvation system. Rogue, like MUD and Colossal Cave Adventure, spawned an entire genre that took its name, the roguelike. Roguelikes are characterized by a high degree of difficulty, permanent character death, and random, procedurally generated levels and items, much like the original game. These were hobby projects done for a niche group of fans and usually very localized around university campuses. However, the RPG genre underwent a tremendous amount of development in the period of the late 70s, considering how few people were actually involved in their production. By the time the 80s rolled around, RPGs had a groundwork. We had conflict resolution using an RNG, the popularity of the high fantasy setting. There was now story and objective-driven gameplay rather than emphasis on scores alone. Multiplayer and procedural content had already been experimented with, and save games were already established. The building blocks for more complete, recognizable, modern RPGs were all in place.